Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you today. And let me start by introducing myself. My name's Chris Kessling. I'm Vice Dean of the Inns of Court College of Advocacy. He says starting an advocacy webinar. That's not a great start. But that's why most people actually call it ICCA, because it's so much easier to say. I'd like to introduce my two colleagues. First of all, Michelle Fawcett, and secondly, Grant Vanstone, both experienced barristers, and also both of whom teach advocacy on the ICCA bar course. I'm just going to pass over to you, Michelle, for a moment. Could you introduce yourself to everyone and tell us a little bit about your background as a barrister?
Absolutely. So called to the bar in 1993, so 30 years worth of experience now. Been teaching at ICCA for the last 18 months. I'm head of conference, but I also teach criminal advocacy. My career was 100% at the criminal bar, grade 4 prosecutor, but also defending in some serious trials, everything ranging from road traffic through to murder. So just a bit of advocacy experience, Chris.
That's really helpful. And Grant, over to you. We've crossed swords, actually, you and I, in court before, up in Leicester back in the day. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I've been a criminal barrister now for 30 something years, and since I was called in 1988, I again have practiced predominantly in crime most of my career. Anything from murder through to shoplifting. I pretty much, I think I've covered everything. I did a bit of regulatory work, police officers, looking after police officers when they got in trouble, both in the Crown Court and in terms of regulatory stuff within the police force, and a little bit of other regulatory work with health and safety. But that's pretty much it, mainly criminal.
That's really helpful. Thank you. For those of you that have noticed, I'm sure that's all of you, you'll see that Grant has a slight delay on his Zoom connection today. We've done what we can to try and resolve it. We can't. So if there's a bit of a sync issue, please don't think it's anything wrong with your device. It's all from our end, as it were. Just a couple of things before we get going. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. I will keep looking at that as we go through, and we will find some convenient moments to stop and answer your questions. So let's get into the meat of this, as it were. This webinar is about advocacy, but it's focused really on submissions advocacy. We're going to be looking at preparation. We're going to be looking at really how you support your arguments, justifying the propositions that you make, a good way of not being asked that horrible question, why? We're going to be looking at, to some extent, skeleton arguments, how you would prepare those and present them. The importance of prioritizing your best arguments, the importance also of recognizing weaknesses in your own case. And then we're going to also move on to presentation, hints and tips from all of us as to how you can really enhance your own presentational and public speaking skills, which will be useful to you in a number of ways. Useful to you if you're doing mooting, useful to you if you're starting on your, I always hate saying this, but your advocacy journey, i.e. you're getting up on your feet for the first time and really starting to experience what that's all about. And useful to you if you're applying for pupillage in early 2024, because undoubtedly, whether you're going down the civil or the family or the criminal route, there will be an advocacy exercise for you at some stage during that process. So let's start at the beginning of all of this. And in many ways, what a lot of barristers, I think, would say is the most important stage, even before we get to the presentational stage, which is preparation. I can always feel a bit of a sense of gloom and doom coming across when I mention preparation. But it is a fundamentally important part of the process you need to go through as advocates. Many people say that actually 95% of good advocacy is in the preparation. You've got to know your case, you've got to know the documents, and you've got to know the law. And then crucially, of course, when whatever the factual context is, to apply the facts of your case to the law. I want to start with you, Michelle, if I can. Is there anything you'd like to add to the importance of preparation and any tips you can give to anyone and everyone that's watching about how you would go about preparing a case, particularly if we think in the context of an appeal?
I think it's a really good point to make, Chris, as far as preparation is concerned, because I don't believe people starting out do actually understand the importance of just taking that time for what will inevitably make the long-term argument so much simpler and so much clearer. A big mistake that we see quite often is people preparing on the basis of, I've read the papers once and I started dissecting and highlighting and cutting people on the first reading, which is crazy, because if you haven't actually assimilated all the facts and the full story, the big picture as we call it, how do you know what it is that you're dissecting and highlighting for importance? You don't understand what the issues actually are yet, or the arguments to be raised. So I think one of the strongest pieces of advice that I always give to the students I teach is that you should be reading any brief a minimum of 3 times. The first time you're going to read that case from start to finish, just to get to know the story, just as if it were a novel, a book of some sort. On the second time, you would approach it from, in fact, the opposition's point of view, those that are trying to prove the case. So in a criminal brief, I always approach it from the prosecution's point of view. They have the burden of proving the case. What evidence are they actually saying they've got to prove the offence charged? It's only having done both of those stages that I would move to actually my client's case, because now I'm in a much better awareness of the arguments that are going to be raised, the arguments I've got to overcome, and importantly, that big picture, the case as a whole. So I think my takeaway for most students is the importance of preparation, why it takes so long to actually prepare, but don't be too eager to just dive in and try and dissect papers when you don't actually know initially what the case is about or what the issues are going to be.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I think also when you're doing an appeal, of course, if you're for the appellant, you're fundamentally seeking to undermine the decision of the court below. If you're for the respondent, of course, you're seeking to support it. So I really like the concept of but actually looking at the case from the other side's perspective. How are they actually going to prove this particular case?
You have to, Chris. It has to be a balanced exercise, I'm afraid, because otherwise you're approaching the case one-sided. And of course, arguments that will be raised at any court hearing by the other side, you're unprepared for if you haven't considered what their possible arguments are going to be. It's always best to try and cut them off before they try and steal the point. Anticipating weaknesses in and looking for weaknesses in their case, but in your own as well, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Grant, what would you like to add to that?
Well, similarly, I think well, firstly, knowing your facts behind the legal principles inside out, so that you are fully aware of how those facts are affected by the legal principles that you're going to be arguing. Because on an appeal, it's going to be a on the basis of the law and the legal principles involved. But those facts that are behind them are going to make it into the particular issue that you are presenting in court. And if it's a mooting competition, it's going to be in terms of the legal principles that you're arguing, but you need to know those facts. So I think there's a massive crossover there. And we'll be coming back to understanding that behind that, you need to understand what your opponent's position is going to be. So you've got to think when you're preparing, what is my opponent going to argue? How are they going to argue this? How would I argue it if I was my opponent? Is another way of looking at it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to finish this particular preparation topic with a quote from Dinah Rose QC, as she was, Casey now, of course, when she came to speak to our students just over, a couple of years ago. And she said this: the most important work that ensures your appellate advocacy is effective occurs before you go into court. Know your case, as she put it, intimately and entirely. Be familiar with every fact, every document, and with all relevant case law. I think that's a really important message for everyone to get. I must say that when Dinah Rose said it, no one was yawning. When I talk about preparation, people yawn very obviously. So that's the difference between me and Dinah Rose. Okay, let's move on to the next thing, which is really about supporting your argument, or what I call avoid being asked why. If you are putting forward an argument to the court, really there's two fundamental parts of that. There's the proposition that you intend to make, the headline, if you like, of your argument. And then beneath that, which is just as important, is the support for that proposition. If you just use the headline and don't use the support, that actually creates a problem. So therefore, that leads to you as an advocate being asked the question, why? And certainly when you're dealing with, as all of us do, Michelle, Grant and myself, in teaching advocacy, particularly to people who are really new to the task, or certainly at the beginning of their careers, very often they lose the concept of really supporting their arguments properly. Sometimes you'll be supporting your argument with case law, sometimes you'll be supporting your argument with statute, sometimes you'll be supporting your argument with regulations, sometimes you'll be supporting your argument with evidence from the case. But you need to support your argument. Let me just give you an example. Let's say you're making a simple submission about attempted murder. You could say, my lord, in my submission, or my lady, in my submission, the mens rea for murder, of course, is an intention to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. But the mens rea for attempted murder is an intention to kill only. And therefore, what's the support for that? You'd refer to a case called Wybrow, a 1951 case. That's the supporting proposition for that. That's a very simple concept. It's very different in academic law, the sort of things that a lot of you will be doing at the moment, where you actually take the case, you dissect it, and then you look at all the relevant parts of it, and then you say, oh, this case means X, it means Y, it means Z. The difficulty is, if you do that in advocacy, if you just take the judge, my lady, if I could take you to the case of X, if you open it at page 1253, paragraph E, and read the judgment of Mr. Justice Vanstone, then you'll read that part out there, and the judge will be thinking, well, it's still well and good, but what's the point? What is the point you're actually making? So that's really academic law. Advocacy is practical law, and it makes all the difference. Michelle, I'm going to move to you. Is this something that you experience, particularly with new students, a lack of justification, if you like?
I think absolutely. I'm forever, just interrupting and saying exactly as you just did. What's the point? It's almost like you need to start with your conclusion, with what your finished point is, and then explain how you've arrived at it. And I think that's important to appreciate, that the conclusion in effect comes first. It's your starting point. This is what I want you to do, and now I'm going to explain to you why you should do it. So it's quite similar in a lot of ways to other advocacy exercises with signpost, when we suggest tell people where you're going, what direction your argument is going in. But in terms of submission advocacy, it's very important to have that bullet point, that headline, that conclusion, so that everyone knows what it is they're actually going to be listening to as far as the rest of the argument's concerned. The other thing I think that we see quite often with students, Chris, is this need to almost get bogged down in case law. You don't need to go off looking for hundreds of really obscure cases just to prove the point. You look for the obvious one that's, quite succinct, has a very narrow point, and it makes it a lot easier, therefore, firstly, to argue it, but secondly, for your tribunal to be able to follow it. So that's one of the things that I noticed, I think, most with students, sometimes the arguments are just common sense. It's always wonderful to have something on paper that supports our argument, but don't be afraid sometimes to just state the inevitable. But a big mistake we see quite often is being too legal, looking for too many cases in support of what's potentially a very obvious point.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice. I'll move on to the concept of taking your best points first in a moment. But Grant, is there anything you'd like to add to what's been said?
No, I think just to add, I think to that is that you don't want to lose sight of the wood for the trees. I think is an expression that comes to mind.
Yeah.
You make it if it's a decent point, just make it and keep it straightforward. Yeah, very often we'll see too many cases with too many not particularly on point elements to it being introduced. You don't need to do it.
I think I really like what you've said about being straightforward. I think in advocacy, simplicity really works.
Yeah, very
and
much so.
It's really interesting because I think, you know, you go into court, you listen to great advocates, and the overall impression can be one of complexity in a complex case. But actually, very often in the most complex cases, the issues, as you were saying, Michelle, are actually relatively confined.
Yeah.
And good advocacy is about really plain speaking, and as you say, Grant, taking straightforward points and putting them in a straightforward way. Is there anything that we can add to that in terms of advice?
I don't think so, Chris. I think, as I say, my biggest point, my biggest takeaway for anyone listening is very much, don't go looking for something on every single point. You do not need to have case law to support sometimes what's a very obvious or a very straightforward point. But if you are going to rely upon any case law or anything in support of an argument that you're making, it's always best to be very clear in terms of direction where the exact part that you're relying on is. There's no point, for example, if you're just going to reference a case without drawing anyone's specific attention to the exact paragraph, because quite often you can have a case that's got hundreds of pages that is completely irrelevant. And so again, it's an important process certainly with submission advocacy, I would say, streamlining, coming out with that headline of what your argument is, what you want to win on, what's your point, as we've been saying, and then have a very short argument in support. The longer you make it, in actual fact, Chris, the less likely you are to succeed.
Yeah. That leads us on, actually, I think, to a very much a conjoined point, which is about clarity and simplicity in many ways, about really prioritizing your arguments. I think it's really important in mooting because, as many of you will know who've done moots, or many of you are soon to find out who haven't yet done them, you will be confined in time to how long you can take, and the courts are increasingly becoming like this, where they expect you to do certain things within certain amounts of time. So it's worthwhile being careful about that. So what I see very often, we'll be dealing with this a little bit more in presentation, is people rushing through their arguments because they've got so many incredibly important points they want to make that they thrust them all on you. And actually, it really dilutes the power of all of them, actually. I've got a lovely quote, actually, here from David Panic in his wonderful book, which I have here, actually, which I recommend, which is his advocacy book. I'm not getting paid, by the way, for promoting that, just in case any of you ask, but it's a really good book. But he refers in his Hamlin Lectures advocacy book to this. He says, I also commend the more pungent comment attributed to an unnamed judge that if at a dinner party you serve a plate of delicious items, but with a turd on top of one of them, none of them will be eaten. I think that's good advice, to stick to the arguments that work and don't throw in those that don't. Let me turn, Grant, to you on this. How often, whether as a moot judge or in court, have you seen other advocates actually really bungle the overall power of their case by throwing in nonsensical arguments?
It becomes really frustrating if you are not going first, as Chris, as you well know from practice, and somebody mangles a point completely before you've had the opportunity to deliver it nice and cleanly, and very irritating. But I think that's right. I like the comment that if you start putting too much into the point so that it's not clear, in way of odieux, might be described as you're going to diminish all of your points as well. They're all going to be lost.
Yeah.
So you want to go for your main points first, and the best points hit hard, and then you can go back to it. But the timing, as we'll see, is also an issue.
That's really helpful. But, same question to you, Michelle. How many times, I bet it's many, have you been in court where you've experienced exactly the same thing?
More often than I'd care to remember, Chris, if I'm honest. We see it obviously at the criminal bar, I guess, quite often in closing speeches and things of that nature, where you just think, wow, so much of what you're wasting jury's time with is completely irrelevant. It carries across, obviously, in legal applications as well. If you have a really strong point in your favour, then argue it, get it out there. I think two things tie in with this, Chris. I forever teach students, look, where's your impact? You know, where's your, as I call it, the mic drop moment? Where's the boom? Work out which one of your points is actually going to make everyone think, I want to hear a bit more about this, because, you know, that's just blown me away. And so it is very much identifying your strongest argument to keep people engaged and wanting to hear more. But it's also about appreciating the brevity. Do not overdo it, because, as you said, the last thing you want to do is dilute what have been very strong and successful points just because you feel this need to now waffle on and on and on. It ties in very much, Chris, with the listener. So in this case, the tribunal's ability to carry out paying attention. And there's been studies on this, and I always love demonstrating it with students. In terms of a person listening, how long do you think you can actually listen to someone's voice talking to you before you switch off? And we start to think about, you know, what we're having for dinner or where we're going at the weekend. And then suddenly go, oh God, what did they say? I'm back in the room. We all do it. It's human nature. But the most recent test, in fact, came out earlier this year. It was reported in the Times. That time concept now is 7 seconds. It's 7 seconds before people start to drift and start thinking of other things. If you have the ability, in fact, to be a good advocate and to do that we'll come on to later as far as presentation is concerned, then it goes up to 2 minutes. But it has now proven that most people will switch off after 2 minutes. And so the reality is, if you've delayed making your strongest point, it now becomes quite worthless, because tests have shown most people have switched off by then. It's another reason why we always say, yeah, take your strongest point of attack first to keep people actively wanting to be engaged with what it is that you're saying.
It raises, I think, another really interesting point, what you just said, that really advocacy isn't simply about presentation. It is actually about some of what people might call the more passive stuff. It's about listening. It's about observing whoever it is, whether it's a jury in a criminal case or whether it's a judge in a criminal or civil case. Really, the impact or otherwise that your submissions are having. Because if you get that, what do you do, Grant, if you get the sense, not of course this will ever have happened to you, but if you get the sense that actually your submissions just aren't hitting home, how do you move on in a strategic, a gentle, polite way?
Well, there's a number of techniques you can use. Most of the time, for instance, with a jury, if I feel that I'm losing that jury on the particular point, is you abandon that point, that you move on to your stronger point, or you move on to the next point. I think it's different with mooting, because you're needing to persuade on a particular point. So it's important that you've worked out what the points are that you want to get across. But if you are not hitting home and you're getting too many questions from your tribunal, too much intervention, move on to another point. There's a reason why there are too many interventions. You are not persuading, and you are there to persuade. There comes a point, and I'm afraid that's down to the individual making a judgment call as to where they go. The other thing that I'll do is I'll start fixing on people and looking into their eyes. I'll raise my voice. I'll change the tempo of the delivery. I'll do all sorts of small things that will try and regain that attention back in and bring them back into the room. bring them back away from their 7 seconds, their shopping list, they're thinking about their dinner.
Those are really important points, I think, for all of us. I think for anyone that's been down to the Royal Courts of Justice to do an appeal, it's a pretty scary place. That's the reality of it. I remember I used to always go to the same robing room at the RCJ because I thought if I don't, maybe this time it won't go well. Not necessarily that it went well last time. I've had some great experiences in the Court of Appeal, and I've had some truly shocking ones. I was about to use another word then. Truly dreadful times there, good and bad. Let me just tell you about a case briefly before we move on when I went down there, because I caught the train with this barrister who will remain nameless, saving blushes and all of that. But he had this particular point. It was in this racially aggravated case where his client in a police cell was alleged to have screamed and shouted racist abuse at a police officer, and he was charged with an offence under the Public Order Act. And he found what he thought was a good defence, where it basically says, the Public Order Act, you can't commit this offence if you're in a dwelling and the same person and the person who you're alleged to have abused is in a dwelling. So he said, oh, well, the police cell is a dwelling. Because there's a bed there, there's a sink there, that's where he does his ablutions and the rest of it. And the judge at the Crown Court agreed. I was sort of left open-mouthed. So it didn't really give a judgment. A recent change in the law had meant the prosecution could appeal matters like that. So in due course, we went down to the Court of Appeal, me for the prosecution, for the appellant, and this person who, as I say, shall remain nameless, for the respondent. And the Court of Appeal just thought the whole thing was actually hilarious. And they came out with this judgment, which I'm going to just read to you, because it just demonstrates the court can really kick you up the backside when you don't get it wrong. And they said to him repeatedly, not all of this is in the judgment, that actually, some counsel make a decision when they wake up in the morning that they're going to pursue a particular line of argument, but lots of those counsel, said the Court of Appeal, by the time they get actually to chambers in the morning, will have thought the better of it. But other counsel won't have thought the better of it. They'll pursue and they'll get to the Crown Court and they'll pursue it there. And if they fall upon just the right judge with the wind blowing in the right direction, things might work out for them there. And then, of course, what happens if things do work out for them, they think, is unfortunately they might find themselves in this court, i.e. the Court of Appeal. And this is what the court said: we respect the achievement of counsel for the defence, Mr. Unnamed, in convincing the judge that a police cell was a home. But sometimes early forensic success meets its nemesis in this court. When a bright idea strikes counsel as a moment of epiphany, it is useful for the advocate to recall the advice of that illustrious member of the modern jazz quartet, Miles Davis, advised, think of a note, don't play it. I, of course, was leaping up and down with joy at this stage. My opponent, not so. And despite him saying how much we were going to enjoy lunch with his people afterwards, he miraculously disappeared and I didn't see him for months. There we are. So that can happen. So choose your arguments with care. I think that's the message that comes out of that.
Really, with that's concerned, Chris, is the stigma attaches. Because, of course, if you do go down that route, Mr. X's reputation is always going to be that now, isn't it? So it's always important to think of the consequences as well. Can I just add two really brief points to that you've just said? First is, if possible, whether it's a moot or in fact if it's an appeal or any kind of trial, always try and find out, if you can, your tribunal, because that can assist in how long and how detailed your arguments need to be. We quite often, if you have a recorder coming into the Crown Court or someone who's not necessarily an appellate judge that you assume to be at the Court of Appeal, you may have to explain things in a bit more detail and go into the law a bit more and set the scene. Whereas, of course, if you have someone where they've been doing this for the last 25 years and they know the basics, they don't need you quoting the law at them. They'll actually be quite insulted if you do. And so sometimes it's worth, just in that preparation stage again, just taking 5 or 10 minutes to actually find out who's going to be hearing your case and what it is that you need to do about it. I think that's it's a big piece of advice that I was taught early on in my career, and it always held me in good stead, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. If I was going to a new court and I didn't know the judge or the recorder, I would, if I could, and wasn't called on, my case wasn't called on first, I would go in and sit there and actually watch the judge and get an idea of what this person was about. Grant, same for you?
Or even ask your colleagues, say, what are they like?
Yeah.
Ask in the roving room, what's so, I've never come across this judge before, what's so-and-so like? And you'll, in the roving room, you get quite an honest answer quite often.
Yeah, I think that's true. Unless someone's desperately trying to wind you up, I think 99.9% of the time, you do get an honest answer. I totally agree about that. I'm going to move on to a subject which I think in many ways is about your credibility as an advocate. It's really important in jury work, but it's as important in front of a judge, and that is that there is not a single case that doesn't have its weaknesses somewhere along the line. Michelle was talking about this earlier, really, in terms of that preparation and case analysis point. You know, look at the case from the other side. You know, anticipate your own weaknesses. You'll be asked about them. It's far better to deal with them along the line. If you have, let me just talk about jury work, for example. If you're in front of a jury defending someone and there is a piece of evidence that is really difficult for you to deal with, ignoring it will not help you. It's a crazy thing to do, but you do actually see it quite a lot. Oh, do you know, let's pretend that doesn't actually exist. We'll move on, make a speech about all the nice parts of my case, and then hopefully the jury will forget. They won't, and nor will judges. They will not forget the weaknesses. Grant, over to you. Your experience of that.
Invariably, just straight on the back of that, you will get a question from the jury about the very thing that you haven't dealt with, that you haven't thought about. You will get a question from the jury invariably, Chris, won't you? Yeah. And it will come straight at you, and you haven't dealt with it, and you've missed your opportunity to deal with it in your closing address, and there it is. You then have to. We know as experienced advocates, you have to formulate the way of answering their question in a way that tries to get your point across. But you fail. You've missed it. It's too late. It's gone. Your opportunity is gone.
And because you didn't deal with it, your credibility in front of that jury is significantly diminished. Right. I think.
And again, as say in mooting and in the same with Court of Appeal, as soon as you don't deal with it, you can be sure they will come at you with a very large stick and beat you with it.
Michelle, have you got anything to add to that?
I would absolutely jump on Grant's coattails there in the nicest possible way, because we always teach and use the phrase insulate against what's going to be an obvious line of attack by the other side. Yeah. The whole point is, if you're going to have to deal with it, so you're either going to deal with it by allowing them to score the point, and then you're making a comeback, which obviously weakens the position in the first place. The reality is, the sooner you can appreciate what the other side are going to be saying, even if it is a massive strength for them, try and cut off some of their mic drop, boom, wow factors by dealing with it first of all. Try and appreciate what the argument's going to be and insulate against what will otherwise be an inevitable line of attack by the other side. Make them have to justify their point and show why it's strong, as opposed to you ignoring it in the first place.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think, you know, one of the things you've got to do at the bar, you've got to acknowledge weaknesses for all the reasons we've said. But really, you've got to try and turn those weaknesses around. And very often, the way that you might perceive something as weak, but actually within the greater context of the case, it's not a weakness. I'll give you a simple example. In a criminal case, you might have what's known as a bad character application. If you're defending, the prosecution might make a bad character application, essentially to get in your client's previous convictions if they're relevant in the context of the offence that's being pursued. And in many ways, they're doing that to demonstrate you're the sort of person that commits this type of offence. That's the whole purpose of it, amongst other things. But very often, you can turn that round and say, actually, despite the fact there was an application, where you're left is with a client who actually you can say has cards on table, demonstrated everything that he or she has done that's bad in terms of criminal activity in their lives. And that can actually place you at quite an advantage in terms of credibility before the jury, and saying, okay, this is the person you're dealing with, that's what it is. And actually it demonstrates a level of honesty on the part of your client that all of those previous convictions are out there. So actually it turns that from a disadvantage actually to some advantage for you. And that's just one of many examples where you have to really think about a situation and think, well, does it actually mean what the other side are saying? Or otherwise, how can I turn that into an advantage for my own client? But that's what the bar's all about, isn't it, Grant?
Sorry. Whoops. Yes, very much so, Chris. And that's where you're adding your value. That's where you are becoming the thing that improves or the commerciality of what we provide as barristers in terms of the input, not just the preparation, but the thinking outside of what does that mean? Where does that take us? Where does this argument take us? And as we began by saying, knowledge of the facts, knowledge of the evidence, and then the principles, and applying it all together and delivering it in a coherent way, signposting, etc., is what we're all about, isn't it?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, I'm going to move on now. We've looked at a number of concepts really about preparing your argument. I'm going to move on to the practical side now of here you are and you're standing up, and imagine a number of you have been there, a number of you won't have been, but you that feeling, you're standing up, there's the judge, and you're about to make your first submission. So we're going to talk about presentation. Before we do, one other thing that strikes me, nerves. I do a lot of talks about advocacy, as all of us do. And very often I say at the end of a talk, I say, now, does anyone have any questions for me about anything that we've talked about? And very often there's none. So I think, oh, well, that's nice. That means that I've done a wonderful job and everyone's been very, very satisfied and the rest of it. And I'm putting my stuff away and I look up and there's a huge queue of people all wanting to talk to me. So I think, well, what's this all about? And very often, I'll tell you what it's about. It's about nerves. It's about how do you overcome that awful feeling that you have been overcome with nerves and get round that. So, Michelle, I'm going to turn to you now because it won't have been the first time you've been asked this question. What advice do you have to say to the budding advocate, if you like, about nerves, who either is going to do a moot or indeed go through an advocacy interview where they know there's going to be a presentation they're going to have to do?
I think there's two things there, Chris. First of all, your confidence will come through if you've prepared. So everything, I'm afraid, that we discuss comes back to preparation, because the more you have understood your case, the points that you are to argue and the arguments that you have in support, the more you believe in that yourself, the easier it is to deliver it. The issue becomes if you're slightly nervous, apprehensive, I'm not sure if that's a really good point, it will come over that way. And so it's about having the conviction of what you believe in, of what you want to argue, first of all. That's why it always comes back to preparation. The other way to think about it, Chris, is quite often I say to students, what they're actually feeling and appreciating isn't nerves, it's adrenaline. And I think most of us that are still in practice and at the bar would stay exactly the same. I'm 30 years cool, but every time I stand up to make an opening speech, I still get that same feeling. And it's a buzz. And the reality is, if you allow yourself to say, that's nerves, I'm nervous, the little voice that we all have in our head starts to get louder and louder. And before we know it, starts suddenly overtaking our thought process. The way to really think about it is it's adrenaline. It's excitement. We know all eyes are on us at this. This is our moment of fame. This is our time to put forward our argument. And start thinking of it in a different way, because the more you allow yourself to believe, I'm nervous, I can't do this, it will absolutely affect your performance. So 2 things. This is why preparation becomes so important. The more confident you are, the more confident you'll deliver it. But secondly, start thinking of it as excitement about the job, about what you're going to do, as opposed to I'm nervous and I can't do this.
I think that's amazing advice. And I totally agree. There's actually been a study on this, that, as Michelle says, in essence, this is adrenaline you're feeling. And you can reframe that from a feeling of nervousness to one of excitement. Yep. And it's been demonstrated that if you do that, of course, familiarity helps with anything, doesn't it? We all know that. But you're absolutely right. Doesn't matter how long you've been doing the job, you will feel that adrenaline when you're getting up to open that big case, or to make your closing speech, or indeed you're standing in the Court of Appeal about to make your first submission. So you've got to turn that round. Again, it's turning it round into something else. Grant, nerves, what's your advice about to the budding advocate about that?
Well, the same has already been delivered.
Yeah.
I go back to a great advocate, Gilly Gray, once said, I sitting in the Old Bailey Robie room listening to him, well, actually we're in the Mets, and said the day that he said the day I stop getting nervous before I make a closing speech is the day I stop. And I think that applies to all of us, very much so. It's about channeling. I think another way of describing it is channeling those nerves into your performance, to use it to your ability, to use those nerves. But if you aren't prepared, then you won't have confidence, and you aren't able to then perform. And like an actor, they have to know their lines. They have to know their lines. So, and again, we don't have a script, but we have to know our lines. We have to know our information that we're trying to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a nice segue actually into really one of the first sort of presentational issues, which I'm sure most of us have experienced with inexperienced advocates, which is pace. Many people speak far too quickly. You don't want someone speaking very, very slowly, because that's boring. And as Michelle says, apparently as human beings, we can only listen for 7 seconds anyway. That doesn't mean you want to force as much as you can into that 7 seconds, because believe me, they will turn off. If people don't understand or can't follow what you're saying, it's not going to work. I always explain it in this way. If you're going too fast, essentially your mouth is ahead of your brain. And therefore, you're not going to have the ability to think about the submissions you're going to make, to articulate them in a meaningful way, which is easy to digest and to listen to. And frankly, because you're going so quickly, you're going to stumble over your words. That's what happens. If you slow down, then your your brain is ahead of your mouth. That makes all the difference. It gives you space, it gives you thinking time, and it makes a huge amount of difference to the quality of your advocacy. Michelle, I'm going to come to you as an experienced advocacy tutor. How often do you experience the problem that I've just explained?
Non-stop. And of course that kicks in more with assessments. It will come in with moots, with being given a designated amount of time, that everyone becomes a prisoner of time and thinks therefore that we have got to race through this, I've got to make every point. And in actual fact, the faster you go through it, the less impact it has, because it's very, very difficult for your audience to absorb what you're saying. And this is what I say to students all the time. You've got to think about your audience, whether that's a single judge, whether it's a appellate bench, whether it's a jury of 12 people. You know what you're saying. You know what the point is, but you have to factor in the speed of sound. And so what you're saying traveling across a room, and in a courtroom, that can be extremely large. Then the other person hearing it, them interpreting it in their own head. Don't ever forget, sometimes your tribunal, whoever they may be, English may not necessarily be the first language. So we may have interpretation skills as well. But for anyone, even if you assume English is the first language, they still have to hear, and their brain has to process the point that you've just made. And for them to think, that's a really good point, actually. If you have progressed with your argument so quickly that in actual fact you're now on point 4 or 5, they've actually missed what you said at points 2 and 3 because they were taking the time to absorb that you had said in the first place. And so very much when we talk about pace, it's not just the pace which you speak. It becomes indicative of you appreciating the pace at which people are able to listen and to actually accept what it is that you're saying. The other thing that I also say with students with pace, Chris, it ties in beautifully with what you've just said. The faster we go, the more that we ramble, the more that our own brains are actually saying to our mouth, can you just slow down a moment? And this is where the inevitable ers and ums come in.
Yeah.
And you can hear it quite often in someone's prose when they're making an and I say to students all the time, just take the pause. The noise is actually a gap filler. If you think about an or an it's 2 seconds. It's because you're going too fast and your brain can't keep up. Rather than have the distraction of an or an just take the pause, slow it down. And if you draw people's attention to it in that way, most people don't realize that they are making ers and ums until you actually point it out to them. But it ties in beautifully with take your time. So 2 factors, be appreciative of your audience, but also don't lower your own standard of advocacy by dipping into those ers and ums just for the sake of taking a pause in your speech.
Grant, what advice would you give to advocates as to how to moderate their pace in the way that Michelle's just described they should?
Well, same thing. Pause. Take a breath. Calm down. Calm your brain down. Calm your speed down. Calm your delivery. Calm. And already I'm beginning to think of what I'm going to say next in that delivery.
Yeah.
He said putting in an there. There you go. Because I looked away from and thinking about what I was doing. I was looking at the response from my fellow presenters, and I've and I've ummed. But that's a specific issue that by pausing, we prevent ourselves from doing. Take that pause. Take that deep breath.
That's really helpful. I know. I remember when I used to do mooting back in the day, far longer ago than I care to remember, that I used to actually write slow down on a page just so I could look at it and remind myself as I was going through. I'm going to move on to, I think, what's a very related subject here, which is about scripting your performance, writing it out, beginning to end, and then standing there with your piece of paper and reading it out and calling it advocacy. It doesn't work. Michelle, why doesn't it work? Give us an example. And why doesn't it work, and how often do you see it, and how often do you have to say, no, don't do it?
In week 1 with every single student on the course that we've taught. The reality, I'm arming now. The reality is it becomes a comfort blanket. If we all had the ability, we'd love to have everything in writing in front of us and just stand there and read it. But you're right, there's no art, there's no skill where that's concerned. I could go out onto the pavement now and ask someone to read it. Does that make them a good advocate? Absolutely not. The problem with scripting is it starts to affect other areas of our presentation, Chris. First and foremost, eye contact. And for me, that's one of, I think, probably the paramount part where delivering advocacy is concerned, that you maintain eye contact with whoever it is that you're speaking to. So your tribunal, I'm going to make sure that they are engaged, because it's no different, is it, to when we're talking to someone in public. You want someone to talk to you, to look at you while they're speaking to you. If people aren't, it's rude. Why are you not looking at me? But it's discourteous. And so if you have a script and inevitably you're going to be reading large chunks from it, your eyes are down, you're reading your piece of paper. And so now we have this issue where your tribunal, whether that's judge, jury, they're not actually listening to what you're saying, because they're actually thinking, why aren't you looking at me? What is it that you've got on that piece of paper? It becomes distracting. The second thing is, most of us with a legal career are speed readers. We have been trained to speed read. We have a lot of information to assimilate in a short space of time. And so the difficulty is, again, when you're scripted, it comes back to pace. You will start talking at a far quicker pace because that's the pace that you're reading it at. And so before you know it, your pace has now been affected. And again, everyone's not listening. They can't absorb the content. You're just racing through it. Another major factor, Chris, and this ties in very interestingly with the study that was published at the beginning of the year. What do you think is the deciding factor in someone forming an opinion of you, a first impression? What do you think it is, Chris?
My tie.
Sadly not. Well, I'd love to be able to say that, but it's actually your tone of voice.
No.
And it's one of the last things that people think about, but tone is so important. And the reality is, if you are reading from a script, at some point we become monologue, we become monotone, and everything just starts going downhill, therefore, and people switch off. So very much the overall art of advocacy is keeping your audience engaged. You want them to listen to more than what you're saying. And if you are appearing to just be reading from a book, they switch off. No one's interested. So reading can affect a variety of different things. And for me, it's a real pet hate, which is why we're so strict at ICCA about not having scripts.
I think it's a really good point that actually all of the individual concepts we're discussing here are very much interrelated.
Yes.
But scripting, absolutely, it really has an impact on pretty much everything. I think, and what I really agree with Michelle is the concept of when people are reading, it becomes monotone. You can tell they're reading. It's what radio presenters called the words lifting off the page. Some people can do that well. Most of us, frankly, can't. Yep. And what you also get, I think, is that when people realize that they sound like they're reading, they start therefore adding false intonation to make it sound like they're not reading. And it just makes them sound like they're reading even more. Grant,
you know what also happens, Chris,
sorry,
which we pick up on non-stop, and it does make us laugh in sessions, is people don't speak as they write. And if you have written a script, what we quite often find is that you end up with students saying, as aforesaid, or as above. Above what? What am I looking at? It's because they're reading what they wrote. And of course, on a piece of paper, it was above that on the paper. It was something they'd said earlier. And the language also, therefore, starts to change. And it's a massive giveaway that you're just reading from a piece of paper. So again, it's this combination of factors that give you away. It's very easy for us to see when someone's scripted. That's why it's important not to do it in the first place. Get rid of the comfort blanket.
Yeah, sure. That's really interesting. Okay, well, anything you'd like to add to that?
No. I made the point earlier about modulation. Yeah.
It's really interesting because I think, as I say, that all of these points are interrelated. And Michelle was talking about eye contact, and again, if you're just looking down at a script, you don't have any of that. And no one's suggesting, of course, that you've got to stare maniacally at the person that you're presenting to. It's natural eye contact we're talking about. But I do, think about it in this way. If you'd been out I don't know, last night, and you'd seen something that you really enjoyed, and you were telling your best mate about it over a coffee, you'd be, whether it was a band, for example, or it could have been Grant playing his new Gibson on the stage, and you'd be telling them it was fantastic, and you'd be looking at them. Can you imagine saying the same thing? Oh yeah, it was fantastic, and not looking at them at all? That would be very, very strange, and it would again impact significantly on, I think, on the force of really what you were saying and how they accepted that or not from you. So eye contact, really, really important. Let's move on to another, I guess, conjoined thing here, which is about posture and movement. I think very often a lot of people who haven't been into the courts in England and Wales and have spent more time on Netflix do think that there's a lot of moving up and down, and actually we don't move at all, Grant, do we? Or how much movement is okay in advocacy? What's your advice?
I have huge difficulty with this one, Chris, as you well know, and my hands start flying around all over the place. So I have to stick. This is a good medium for me because I'm simply on that square. But what I do is I place one hand behind me and tuck it into the back of my trousers to stop it from moving around, and the other one on a lectern or in front of the desk so that it doesn't keep moving around or flapping about, distracting people. And stand straight and smart.
Yeah,
that's all I can say.
It's really interesting because I was going to add that here I am holding a pen. If you hold something, any sort of form of prop, you can guarantee you will start waving it around as if you're conducting an orchestra. Or you see people tapping it and they don't realise that that's what they're doing. It's one of the reasons that, yes, or clicking it, absolutely. And it's incredibly grating to listen to. But nonetheless, I think it's something, it's one of the reasons actually why we record students, so that they can go back and watch themselves, because all of us could watch our performance and think, oh my goodness, I didn't realize I did that umming, that erring, I didn't realize I moved around so much, or turned to the left and turned to the right, waved my hands, clicked my pen, whatever it might be. But it's such a useful exercise in actually finding out what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. I'm going to move now, in the last 4 minutes that we've got, to a question that I get asked an awful lot, which is about questions, really, answering questions. You should expect that the judge will ask questions of you. In a moot, it's part of the way you're scored. So turning to you, Michelle, what's the advice you'd have to the budding advocate as to how to answer questions well?
Listen to the question, because quite often people don't actually listen to the question, interpret it in the way that I thought that's what they said, and before you know it, your answer is completely irrelevant and in fact quite often wrong. And so the biggest piece of advice there is just listen. If you need to take that pause again, just take a second or two to think about the question rather than go rambling into an answer which in actual fact is incorrect. You gain so many more points. You're not going to lose points by taking a pause just to gather your thoughts on it. But the biggest takeaway with questions is listen, make sure you've actually understood the question. There's nothing wrong with clarifying the question, Chris. If it's something that you didn't understand, I would always come back with, are you asking? Did you mean anything to make sure I have understood what's being asked of me? But the most important thing is to make sure that you've got the right answer for the right question.
Yeah. Grant, what's your best advice?
I adopt and endorse what Michelle's just said, but it boils down to that credibility issue again.
Yeah.
Because if you're not listening to the question and you aren't answering it, and politicians do it all the time, we are not politicians. We are advocates. We're there to persuade people, and not just get our agenda across. And in doing that, we have to answer that question. Otherwise, we lose the credibility with whether it's mooting, it's juries, whoever it is.
Yeah, it's really interesting. All of us, to everyone that's viewing this, judge a lot of moots. And one thing that I experience really quite often is a sense of real irritation come across the face of the mooter, of the advocate, when I butt in. It's like, hold on, you're interrupting my argument.
Your speech.
Yeah, absolutely. What has become a speech. And as Grant said, this is something you should really be using to advance your argument further. I think one of the difficulties, and this goes back to scripting, is that if you have a script which is just one big block of text, and you're planning to move from argument 1 to 2 to 3, and suddenly I say to you, well, actually, I'm only really interested in argument 3. You're thinking, you've ruined my structure. You've ruined the whole plan I had. And it throws you out and it shows irritation. Again, be prepared, I think, to be versatile. You should really look at your arguments as separate segments that you should be capable of moving around, think expansively, and look like you actually want to help the judge. The final thing I would say is really picking up on Michelle's point, which is listening. Listening is so important in advocacy. And what you get, which is again related to the look of irritation, you sometimes get people who anticipate, and very often wrongly, what your question is going to be, and therefore they cut across you. And whilst the intention may not actually to be rude, it comes across as extraordinarily rude, and it's a really good way of losing a moot, I can promise you. So it's a good way of not getting a pupillage, and it's a good way fundamentally of winding up your audience. So and that's actually using the winding up. We've actually got to 1:30. I am amazed actually we've got so much done in an hour. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. It's been a pleasure to see so many of you. A huge thanks to Michelle and to Grant for helping out today. And we hope to see you. We've got one more webinar. This is document applications. If you go onto the events page on our website, you can see that. Many of you I know will be coming up to our open day, which is a few weeks away now at Gray's Inn. And of course, for those of you that can't see this, or you know of people who haven't been able to make it today, this whole webinar will be recorded and will be available to view from our events page. So it leaves me to say thank you from all of us. It's been a pleasure. Have a lovely afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.